This conference will now be recorded.
Fine. So yeah, this is the appraisal framework in case the Dropbox folder doesn't work. And actually, it's not too big a set of files. So if you need me to email you the files, let me know. But otherwise, just get it from the Dropbox. And I would like you also to follow this link to get a random number between 1 and 2, and that will determine whether you're assessing the validity or the results of the study. And the task you're going to have, if you're a number 1, you're going to consider the validity of the study, which means you're going to look primarily at the methods and also the summary of studies that were included, which is figure 1 and table 1. If you got the number 2, you're going to be looking at the results. You're going to rely on other people to tell you whether the study is valid. And that means, unsurprisingly, focusing on reading the results. Helps if everyone reads the abstract because it just gives you a brief overview. And if you run out of time, so if you finish, by all means move on to the other task. We've also provided in a subfolder in the Dropbox, there's a few biophysical studies looking at the effect on work of breathing of switching between high flow oxygen and nasal cannula, high flow oxygen and CPAP, and also nasal cannula oxygen and air, in case you're interested in the underlying biophysiology and whether it's affecting work of breathing. All right. So this just gives you a little insight into what sort of questions we're asking. When we're thinking about validity, we're thinking, are there factors in the study design or the way it was executed which might cause the estimates to be biased, pushed in favour of one or the other treatment? If you're looking at the results, you're trying to say, what actually did this study estimate the effect of one thing to be compared to the other, and how precise is that estimate? So that means looking at confidence intervals as well as the point estimates. And when you're looking at the confidence interval, you're thinking, does it exclude the number that corresponds to no difference? And if you're talking relative risks, that's 1. If you're talking about risk differences, no difference is 0. And then together as a group, we'll think about applicability. If we're thinking that the study does give us reasonable information, can we apply those results to our patients? Or do we come to a different conclusion because there's some special factors for us? All right, so I haven't had any messages suggesting you're struggling to access the files, so that's great. So without further ado, I will bring it up and we will have about 20 minutes to work through the group work. I've got some slides here which will just take you through a little bit of information as we go. People have asked about sharing these. I will stick those into the Dropbox as well at the end of the session. I think that probably makes sense. Someone said can't open Dropbox, so I will email Dr. Nicol now. So yes, please start. I'm going to mute my microphone, but please, any questions, if you've got things that come up that aren't clear, type into the chat box and we're here to help. All right.
Hello, everybody. It's been 20 minutes now, so we're just going to move on to the critical appraisal part. So we will start by having a look at the validity. So if everyone can get their CUSP tools out to see what we think about each aspect of it. So first of all, moving swiftly on to the first question. Did everybody think that the systematic review and meta-analysis addressed a clearly focused question? If you can talk if you like, or if you want to, if it's easier, we can use the chat box to see what you think. Oh, I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, no, I meant everyone else if they wanted to speak.
Oh, sorry, yes, of course. Yes, they addressed two questions. For the sake of timing, we decided that we'd focus on the first part, which is the primary respiratory support. So Ritu says yes. Can anybody give the sort of focused question, the PICO question, out here onto the chat? Because basically the paper is asking what our question is asking as well. In preterm infants, does using high flow oxygen versus CPAP have any differences in their primary respiratory support outcomes? The only thing that we thought was something that you could potentially specify a little bit more is what you mean in terms of preterm. Do they mean anyone less than 32 weeks? Is this the extreme preterm group or the later preterm group? So that could be something that they could potentially have a think about. Now, the outcomes that they give us is respiratory failure, which is intubation within 7 days of starting on non-invasive respiratory support. And they also look at time to establishing feeds as well. So those are the interesting outcomes that they look at. So fine, we think that the question overall is pretty focused. So do you think that the review looked at the right type of papers? What did they specifically want to capture in their papers? Yep, so there's a general yes consensus there, where everyone agrees that a randomized control trial and looking at randomized control trials is the best sort of way of looking at this question. So we all agree that this is the right type of paper that they were looking for. And it does directly address their questions. So moving on to the next question, did we think that all relevant studies were included given their search strategy? What did you think of their search strategy? Anybody? Any takers on the search strategy? So there's general some yeses. Anybody disagree with that at all? Yeah, so the specific things that we look at, that there's no language restriction. They look at multiple different database sources. They also contact authors when they haven't got the databases, the papers information. So they've done a lot of things that you'd think would actually expand to a lot of different studies. However, actually, when we did this, so when we ran it, we identified a paper that this meta-analysis missed, which was a very big trial, the HIPSTER trial, which came out of the New England Journal of Medicine, that had the biggest number of infants. And the reason they may have missed this is actually because their search strategy wasn't very comprehensive. So they only used terms like preterm infant, high flow oxygen, or cannula. They used the word cannula. So I think they probably unintentionally restricted some of their search because of the fact that the search strategy wasn't comprehensive enough. And actually, it would be very interesting to know what adding that huge trial would have done to this meta-analysis results, because it would have definitely swayed it one way or another, probably. But overall, we think that they approached it in the correct way. So they tried their best, but they missed something that was quite big. So we move on to the next question, which is, did the review's authors do enough to assess the quality of the studies? What did you think about the assessment? So that looking at individual studies to see whether or not they were good enough to be able to put into a meta-analysis.
My impression was they did a fairly standard job. They sort of used the standard Cochrane tools for assessing risk of bias. And I don't know, if you open the supplement, they presented some of that data graphically on the quality of studies.
Yes, I agree. And so they did what Andrew mentions about standard in a meta-analysis sort of review of these quality of papers is they used a standardized tool, which is the Cochrane. Yeah, absolutely, Ritu. So they use the Cochrane risk assessment tool, which is a very standardized tool that we use. There are different ones that we had mentioned last week about grade as well, but that's the tool that they used was standardized. They used 2 reviewers, and they also sort of resolved any conflicts with a 3rd reviewer as well. So that was very standard in what you would expect in a meta-analysis to do.
Actually, I think Northwick are suggesting that they didn't have a 3rd reviewer, but it might be nice if they did to resolve the disputes.
Oh, okay, yeah, no, absolutely. Sorry, you're right. There wasn't a 3rd reviewer. They just solved it between themselves. You're right. So that would be overall yes, we believe. So the next question is about, do we think that the results that they found of these separate papers, was it reasonable to combine them all together? Were they similar enough, do we think? Yes, so looking at overall, what sort of characteristics did each each of these papers show, which is in table 1, as Andrew's mentioned. Anybody think that they were not similar at all? Do you think that they shouldn't have done the meta-analysis? I think it's interesting because actually the papers that they used are probably comparable. Yes, Rita, exactly. But this is something that we also thought was interesting. They looked at the antenatal steroids part, but they combined everyone together. So do we think these groups are comparable enough if only 40%, for example, received antenatal steroids versus 100% in another group, for example? Other things that I guess, is it, yeah, exactly, Ritu. The other thing that we need to think about is, are these premature, these preterm infants, is it okay to lump all of them together, or do we say less than 28 weeks, 28 to 32 weeks, and the late preterm, etc.? So that which they hadn't done, and they hadn't a priori before actually doing the analysis said, we're going to do subgroup analyses on these different gestational groups. And as Rachel said, weights as well. Completely agree. So I think overall, it's probably that we say we can probably combine them because the studies are pretty similar, they're asking similar questions, but there's a lot of things that we just need to be mindful of when we are looking at the results, which is going to be the next section. We're going to, yes, and as Andrew's mentioned about heterogeneity, we're going to look at that to see if we were right in thinking that they were similar enough when we look at the results. So let's go on to the results itself. So the results group, what were the overall primary outcome results that they talked about? So for respiratory failure was the primary outcome, as we can remember. What was their clinical, well, what was the study's bottom line? So this is on the forest plot, figure 2, and the first section of their subgroup analysis. So this is the primary respiratory support section. So basically, they talk about, oh, someone has said, yes. Sorry, there is a bit of delay coming through. Sorry about this, guys. So treatment failure was similar between CPAP and high flow, Rachel says. And yes, George and Andrew are saying, Andy is saying the same thing. They're saying that they were similar and there's no significant difference between the group. Yes, Rachel, the post-extubation was a bit better, but just because of timings, we're just going to focus on the primary outcome, the primary respiratory failure outcome. So that's what they have mentioned. And when we look at the result itself, more specifically, we can see that the risk ratio that they identified was 1.03, and because the confidence interval is crossing 1 here, between 0.79 and 1.33, we know that there was no significant difference between the two groups and that they were similar, as Rachel, Andy, and George said. What do we think about the how precise that result is?
I can chip in with a little slide, which might help. This just shows us an application of the results by turning the relative risks into absolute risks.
So what we're mentioning here is, because what we want to know is how is this relevant to our risk ratio? How can we convert this into a numbers needed to treat question? You know, what does this mean to us clinically? And when we convert the relative risk into an absolute risk reduction, so subtracting them, we find that the absolute risk reduction is negative 0.4%, and the way to identify the numbers needed to treat from that is 1 divided by the absolute risk reduction. So when we do this, we identify that for every 100 patients treated, we're getting about 4 more failures within the high flow group, but this is not significant statistically, and therefore it's difficult to interpret these results and say, you know.
Yes, I'm basically saying that we're saying, you know, we can't see a significant difference, but we don't. But if there is a difference, we think it's, you know, likely to be less than, you know, 4 in either direction. So we're looking at a small difference. I deliberately didn't convert it into a number needed to treat because it's difficult to interpret numbers needed to treat for non-significant results.
Absolutely.
So Ritu is pointing out that, yeah, there's still heterogeneity in the studies prior to this, but actually what's quite encouraging is overall the heterogeneity of the results doesn't seem that bad.
So when you look at
the studies are including different ages, different weights, different background rates of having had steroids, and they're all contributing towards the estimate, overall the heterogeneity estimated through this I-squared is quite low.
Which is reassuring to say that these studies probably, however they've combined them, are pretty similar. So But that can also be because the confidence intervals are quite wide as well within each study. So, but having said that, overall, the heterogeneity doesn't look that high. But Ritu, as you said, there's a lot of things at the beginning that we need to think about in terms of gestational age, in terms of weight and steroids, etc., which may actually make it very, very difficult to interpret the study finding. So we've looked at the primary outcome. So let's move on to what they thought about, because we've got 10 minutes left, and last week we got immediately cut out at 2 o'clock, so I'm just mindful of time. So let's move on to the applicability part of the study. Do you think that the results that we find here seem to be, so Dr. Nicol is just saying, is there a selection bias of papers all seem Southeast Asia and China? This is, again, something that I'd mentioned in the beginning as well, that because of the way they've written their search strategy, it looks like they've actually missed a few quite important trials as well. I think if there is a potential selection bias, but there's definitely some key papers that were missed, as we mentioned about the hipster trial as well. So moving on to the Dr. Nicol still believes that there's no difference between CPAP and high flow oxygen. Is that right, Dr. Nicol?
And I guess that's our starting point anyway, unless we can prove otherwise.
Exactly. So moving on to the local population. So do you think we can apply the findings of this meta-analysis to our own population? I think even though Dr. Nicol had mentioned about this, lots of studies are from Southeast Asia and China, but there are quite a few trials from all over the world. So, and Andy's saying yes, that this can be applied to the local population, which I agree with. I think they are pretty similar in terms of what we see in our population. As Ritu had mentioned previously, if we had further defined some of our gestations and weights, etc., it may have been even more applicable and easier to interpret. So overall, I think we would say that yes, we could apply it to our own population. And do you think that all important outcomes were considered? What other things would we be thinking about when we're looking at high flow versus CPAP? And this is in the methods section of the study. They did talk about all the outcomes that they wanted to look at. So there was actually, they did intend to look at things like mortality, other outcomes as well. So I think they had the good intention to look at all the outcomes, but maybe couldn't find them to be able to meta-analyze those outcomes that they were specifically looking at. So we can say they've tried, but was there anything in particular that you would have wanted to have also seen in terms of outcomes? I think everyone seems. Oh, Rachel's just mentioned BPD, long-term oxygen requirements. Again, completely agree. In the methodology section, they do mention that they wanted to look for BPD and supplemental oxygen. Yeah, as Hisham's also pointed out, but probably they just didn't have the right results to be able to meta-analyze from the findings of the different studies. So in terms of the last question, do you think the benefits of using either of these different types of non-invasive respiratory support the benefits of using high flow are worth the harms and costs? You know, does this study give us the answer to this? What do you think?
I feel a lot of caution because of what you told me about missing a big trial. That makes me worried until I've seen that trial.
Absolutely.
And at least we know here, but the problem is it's the unknown unknowns. It's when you don't know that there's the missing important trial.
And I guess the other thing that with that trial, which was interesting, was that they found that high flow they had to stop that trial early because high flow had much higher respiratory failure compared to the CPAP group. So it's definitely something we have to be very cautious about, because this is not what our meta-analysis is necessarily mentioning. And Ritu, you had just mentioned they looked at analysis at 7 days. But yes, exactly. They don't look at sort of the first 72 hours, which can be very relevant as well. Yep, there's side adverse effects that come from CPAP, which can be, you know, this is a harm that potentially, if there is no significant difference between using high flow versus nasal cannula, having nasal trauma might be actually something very significant that we need to consider. So I think overall, there are potential harms associated with CPAP that we need to think about, and pneumothoraces, exactly.
So I guess it would be interesting is perhaps we don't need to do a survey on what your preferred method of respiratory support is now, but perhaps has this let us know if this has changed your view at all. Has this, you know, made you feel that, you know, your original preference isn't valid and now you should be more ambivalent? Or does it just leave you thinking, well, if I preferred CPAP, I still prefer CPAP. Or if I prefer high flow, I still prefer high flow.
George, does this still mean you're still don't mind between high flow and nasal cannula? Sorry, nasal CPAP.
Mm-hmm.
Andy's saying still stick to CPAP. George is saying still think he would use either, but it's debating onto CPAP.
Yeah, I had a very quick look at the abstract of the other paper, and what's interesting is what is failure of CPAP is needing to be intubated, whereas failure of Optiflow, of high flow, was needing to be intubated or escalating to CPAP. So I need to read it in more detail, but it seems like it may be a little bit unfair because high flow had more ways to fail. Okay, and yeah, we haven't looked at pneumothoraces. That would be interesting because I have seen that mentioned, the idea that high flow has fewer pneumothoraces. Did we come across anything on harms?
So there were, in the paper, they do mention about looking at it. So they looked at, Andy had mentioned nasal trauma and pneumothoraces. So
okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, while we come in to wrap up, I just thought it'd be nice to have one slide, which I'll stick into the folder. I'll stick all of this into the Dropbox folder if you want to take anything. Non-inferiority versus superiority. You'll often see trials reported as either looking for superiority or looking to see that one treatment is non-inferior. That's got a statistical interpretation about which type, exactly how you run the tests, and that can get a little bit confusing. But actually both are relatively easy to interpret when you think about the confidence intervals, and I've just tried to illustrate it below, where we have down the middle here some measure, and this means no difference, and then to the left it means the intervention is better, to the right it means the control is better, and in a superiority trial what we're looking for is clear evidence that one treatment is better than the other. So we'll define a threshold of our minimal clinical difference, you know, what matters to us. We might not be interested in a 1% reduction, we might be looking for 5%. And then we look to see whether the estimate and the confidence interval lies entirely within the region of interest. So in this case, the first result here would say actually that's statistically significant, but it isn't reaching our full threshold of clinical significance. So we could say, well, it might be clinically effective as we want, but we're not totally sure. Whereas this result here would be lying totally within the region of clinical results that matter to us. We're thinking about non-inferiority studies. What we're doing is we're defining a threshold of similarity. We're saying as long as the estimate lies within this threshold, we're saying it's similar enough for us to say we can use them interchangeably. So the two examples here show where you'd have different evidence. The first one here has a point estimate that's very close to no difference, but the confidence intervals are wide, and they include the possibility that the intervention or the control could be more different than we want. Whereas the second estimate, the confidence interval is entirely within that small threshold thing. And that's so non-inferiority trials where you're trying to say that within our confidence interval, these two treatments are similar enough. It's quite hard to power them. You need lots of participants in studies to get a narrow enough confidence interval often to fit within the window. So I just hope that would be a useful way to end. So bottom line, it hasn't really pushed us. Someone did a lot of work on that meta-analysis, but we're left believing what we pretty much believed in the beginning. That's a bit of a shame for them. So as always, we're very interested in your feedback. I am, as we speak, copying this link in here. We've read it every week, and we try to improve what we're sharing. One of the things that people have said is they want to see what we're doing and share the files. So I'm going to put those into the Dropbox at the end of this so that they are downloadable. So on that note, I think we can end the session. Daphne, anything you want to add?
Just wanted to take this opportunity, if anybody is interested in renal next week, we've got Journal Club on a renal topic. So if anyone would like to do that, just drop us a line. If not, we'll see you next week with a renal question.
Let me just type in my email address, andrew.mccardle@gmail.com. It's in the chat there if anyone wants to take that and drop us a message. All right, thanks, Dr. Nicol. Thank you, everybody, and see hopefully many of you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.